Hello, welcome to this conversation with Thea Riofrancos and Bret Gustafson for this special video. Thank you both for being here, and thank you to the Baffler, which has provided some superb questions to spark conversation. And you can also find an audio transcript of this interview from them as well. Thea Riofrancos is Assistant Professor of Political Science at Providence College and co-author of A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal, and also here to discuss her book, just recently out this past August, Resource Radicals, From Petro-Nationalism to Post-Extractivism in Ecuador. Bret Gustafson is Associate Professor of Sociocultural Anthropology at Washington University in St. Louis. He is the author of New Languages of the State, Indigenous Resurgence and the Politics of Knowledge in Bolivia, also published by Duke University Press, and here today to discuss Bolivia in the Age of Gas. Thank you both so much, and welcome.
Thank you.
So to start off, both of these books grow out of deep ethnographic research. To different degrees, you seem to have both participated in or witnessed at close range the political movements you are analyzing. With that in mind, can you tell us something about your political formations and the paths that led you to writing these books?
Yeah, I'll speak a little bit to this question, which I really appreciate, sort of connecting ethnographic methods and access and embeddedness in social movements with like a broader political trajectory or formation that might have preceded that, which was certainly the case for me. This book came out of a moment in which I lived in Ecuador prior to attending graduate school and prior to knowing that I'd be writing a dissertation, let alone a book. In 2008, when my partner and I moved to Ecuador to sort of be a part of, bear witness to, but also in some way be involved in a process of tremendous political and social transformation that was unfolding at the moment, which was the election of Rafael Correa, the country's first democratically elected, really left or socialist identified president, along with, of course, the parallel processes that are called the pink tide across the region of a lot of left governments coming to power. In addition, Ecuador, again, similar to other countries, but in ways that sort of stood out to us, had this decades of really inspiring social struggles and social movements, particularly the indigenous movement and a sort of array of popular sector movements that it was in alliance with, fighting neoliberalism, rapacious forms of resource extraction, and for kind of like a different vision of what the state and economy and society should look like. So my partner and I moved there kind of coming out of years of sort of what's called solidarity activism, work that is US based, but is in solidarity with movements in Latin America. And so it definitely, in a sort of tracing the origins of the book, it certainly came out of a moment of political activism in my life that has continued and taken new forms. And that did give me what we might call like access, to use kind of methodological terms, to movements that I wouldn't have had in the same way had I not had my own history of involvement, both from afar in the US and within Latin America. And I think that shows through, or I've been told by readers that it shows through in the narrative of the book, that it there's a sense of feeling present in the thick of sort of movement activity. There's a sense of intimacy that wasn't even per se my intention to relate, but readers have used that word. And so, yeah, I just will just say I agree again with the thrust of the question, which is sort of connecting ethnography to political commitment to sort of forms of narration. Not that every ethnographer is per se politically committed, but in my case, there was certainly a connection between those two things.
Yeah, no, that's a lot of similarities with my own experience. I went to Bolivia a long time ago, the early 1990s, before grad school, and spent a lot of time working with indigenous movements, particularly Assembly of Guarani people. And it's from that perspective that I wrote my first book, and this book developed out of ongoing collaboration with the Guarani and other parts of the country, but it kind of tracks the political trajectory of the country itself, because the Guarani in the 1990s were mobilizing for land and language rights. When Evo Morales started to rise to power, most of the Guarani I work with expressed their sympathy with Evo and the MAS and joined in that struggle. And that struggle was partly electoral, but it was also in the streets. So as I continued to spend time with the Guarani in the Chaco, their struggle over land and language also became inflected by the question of Evo Morales and the MAS, but at the same time, the expansion of the gas industry. These two processes came almost at the same time. And so the story that I tell is in part the story of the Guarani, but it's also in part the story of the whole country grappling with a lot of natural gas, a lot of social frustration, a lot of inequality and poverty, and a real contradictory situation where you have immense natural resources, very much like the case of Ecuador and Thea's book, immense natural resources and really complex efforts to try to use those resources to address poverty and exclusion. So as far as my own political formation, it sort of developed along that path, is watching the growth of indigenous movements and the rise of Evo Morales, and then seeing how that story gets complicated later in the mid-2000s towards 2010, 2011. But yes, hopefully, I haven't seen a lot of reviews yet, but I'm hoping it gets a similar response to that of Thea's, is that when you spend a lot of time in a place and you get to know people, hopefully you the attempt, at least my attempt when I'm writing, is to try to do justice to their struggle. And that's what I hope to have done.
Great, thank you so much. So the second question is about some of the contradictions that you both describe in your books, about the pink tide, which we tend to think of as a movement that opposed neoliberalism, bringing to power interventionist regimes that invested state resources, particularly the revenue from natural gas and mining sales, into welfare, thereby meaningfully fighting poverty and improving social indicators across the board. But can you both speak a little bit to the contradictions that you find in, what it means to continue to invest this money and to continue to draw upon this money for welfare and other programs?
Certainly, and something that Bret said in a way is kind of frames my answer to this question, that it was, precisely as he was just recounting his own political sort of point of view being deeply shaped by the struggles that he was witnessing sort of as a participant, observer and scholar over many years. Something similar about my own experience in Ecuador prior to conducting field work, but also continued while I was conducting field work, was that it really changed my understanding of the world, my understanding of capitalism, my understanding of politics, my understanding of what development means, my understanding of what the environment is, even what nature is, humans' relationship to nature. All of those kind of bedrock conceptual understandings were really shaken by my first couple of months in 2008 in Ecuador, where I realized, or I began to realize that, again, as Bret just said, that the issue of extraction, of territorial control, of indigenous sovereignty, and of how humans and nature relate were like extremely salient issues on the political stage, dividing leftists against one another, dividing movements against one another, dividing movements and the state. And I had not, while I had considered myself like an environmentalist, or for sure, I had not really thought of it of those issues as issues that would deeply divide the left. And I think that understanding and my own sort of awakening that there are different left, different critical, different movement oriented, however you want to characterize it, ways to think about nature, territory, indigeneity, that are in contention with one another, even as they draw on shared kind of legacies, was like really eye-opening to me. And I'll just, that's a bit of a preamble. I'll just say one brief thing about the actual, what the question actually asked, and then turn it over to Bret, which is that, I think that what emerged and what I witnessed in Ecuador over the years that Rafael Correa was in power was different visions and understandings of what is wrong with neoliberalism or capitalism, or colonialism, right? These legacies and ongoing realities of oppression and domination. Like, what's wrong with those systems? And then concomitantly, like, what do we want to replace them with? Like, what are we striving for? What is our vision of a better society? And the pink tide, in ways that I think are very inspiring, but also in ways that became very fraught and conflictual, like occasioned these deep conversations about like, what is our critique and what is our vision for how to make society better. And we could call that a contradiction, and I probably do use that term a lot in my book. The contradiction between, as the question laid out, like a government that intended to use revenues from resource extraction to bring some kind of social development and equality, empowerment, and reduce poverty, versus movements that were increasingly militantly opposed to extraction. So we can see that as a contradiction, and I do, but I think from another point of view, we can see the social struggles and the pink tide that resulted from them as being a context in which those visions could even emerge and be articulated and come into tension with one another. So I think there are different ways to think of it, as a contradiction or as this sort of generative moment of two very distinct visions emerging. But certainly it changed my own view, and it continues to like reverberate in my thinking of change my own approach to how I critique global capitalism and the sort of better type of society that I subscribe to and hope to build along with others.
You could certainly almost say the exact same thing about Bolivia. I was just looking here in the introduction to my text where I point out this exact contradiction. I actually cite Thea here, who described this new progressive extractivism as commodity-dependent left populism. But from a different sector of the left, they've actually accused Evo and the MAS of being basically an expression of imperialism. So there's a huge interpretive gap there between how you look at what was happening. Was this the deepening of capitalism, or was this a challenge to capitalism? So I think Thea is exactly right about that sort of overarching schism there, and how, in my own experience in the early days of let's say, Evo, we were all cheering. We were sitting way out in the Chaco with my friends and thinking about, oh wow, the revenues from the gas are going to help you build new schools and new health posts and so on. And then as time passed, I became more involved with climate-related action here at home, and sort of started thinking a little more deeply about, well, natural gas is better than oil, but it's not exactly as good as other things. So there's another contradiction there. There's the climate contradiction in both of these cases. And there were lots more. The gas industry is basically, it's sort of deepens a kind of a patriarchal model of extractivism. It deepens connections to the military as it's kind of is an expression of Bolivian nationalism. So it sort of raises up the military in political performances and spectacles, which is also sort of a patriarchal expression. In terms of sovereignty, this was what was pursued with nationalization or pseudo-nationalization, was more sovereignty, more ability for the country to determine its own path. In many ways, they did. Evo they would write reports to the IMF each year and say, thank you for your recommendations, but we're going to do it our way. It was amazing after neoliberalism. On the other hand, it wasn't so sovereign when it came to the foreign gas companies who, once things started slowing down, if they said, well, you need to ease back on indigenous rights so we can do our job more easily, then Evo said, well, okay. And that was a huge contradiction between his own indigenous identity and the protection of indigenous rights. So from top to bottom, lots to say. I think Thea might want to add something there. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I didn't mean to cut you off.
That's all right. No, that's great.
Not at all. That I just wanted to underscore something you said, because I left it out of my own response, but I think it's really important, which is that, you sort of moved from framing it, similarly to how I did, which is these two visions in contention with one another. But then you also, I think, towards the end of your answer, were pointing out how the contradictions are not just between two discrete, though interrelated, kind of visions of what a better society might look like and how to fight for it within the left, but also that just on the government side, like just on the side of this particular model of commodity-fueled left populism, there were internal contradictions within that model, right? And one of them is around sovereignty, right? As you just laid out, which is like, there's a vision of sovereignty in which the state, takes more ownership role, equity stakes, more of a policy coordinating role, more regulation. And all of this happened in Bolivia, actually much more than it happened in Ecuador. But that could translate into something like resource sovereignty. However, the flip side of that was actually more embeddedness in regional and global markets in ways that provide real limitations on sovereignty and actually reinforce patterns that began under the prior neoliberal governments that these left-wing governments, emerged in order to depart from, right? And so there's like a contradiction, and I think we could find, if we want to be, critical readers, we could find tensions and contradictions within the movements that are anti-extractivist, right? I mean, I'm not saying that it's only the government. I think all of us as humans are contradictory, right, in various ways. That's just kind of a thing that we do. But I think part of what's interesting about this moment is that the left in power, the means that it had available to it to achieve forms of transformation, to achieve like post-neoliberalism, were very fraught means that were, they made history under the circumstances that they found themselves in. And they found themselves in circumstances that had been deeply shaped by neoliberal market integration. And they did what they could in those circumstances, and we can critique them. But I think it's interesting to think about the tensions within that model, including the very notion of a kind of boom and bust cycle in which at some point the boom is going to end. And then what do you do when the revenues dry up? And, fascinating to think about a new left government coming into power in Bolivia in a moment of a commodity bust, really, or a sort of low commodity prices. But that's, one of many kind of internal tensions or contradictions to that extractive model of development.
Well, I like that. They did what they did given the circumstances, and they also did what they did a lot better than a neoliberal government would have done. So at the end of the day, I'll take it. Yeah.
So, and some of this, maybe there will be a little overlap here, but both Correa and Morales came to power riding on massive support from indigenous and campesino communities. Yet these are the very people who are today opposing the extractive industries on which the governments rely to raise revenue. How did this change come about? It seems to me this pivot from opposing neoliberalism to opposing extractivism lies at the heart of both of your books. Does it represent an about face, or is there a hidden through line that we are missing?
Thea, you want to start?
I started to feel bad about being the first responder and everything. Right. I'm happy to do it, and we'll go back and forth. But I think that the question captures it well in the case of Ecuador. I'm really curious to hear what Bret says, because I think in the case of Bolivia, I wonder if it's the same. I think in Ecuador, what I did observe as a sort of ethnographer in the moment of Correa being in power was a real sea change in movement discourse between an almost exclusive and very insistent focus on neoliberalism as the target of movement critique and of the system that they wanted to transcend and overcome, to a shift towards seeing extractivism or extractivismo as like the primary target of resistance and the system that needed to be overcome. And, we could get into, and we might a bit later, because I think there might be a question on this, like about the terms that activists use and the meaning of those terms. But let me just say very quickly now that one important thing to note about extractivismo is that in the usage of activists, it's almost a broader term than neoliberalism, and actually in their usage, a broader term than capitalism, meaning that they saw socialist, whether self-identified socialists like Correa and Morales, or like actual existing socialism like the USSR, right? Like they saw those systems as guilty of the pathology of extractivism as well. And so it's not that they didn't see capitalism as like a root problem, which they did, but it's more that they saw that attempts to transcend capitalism, i.e. socialism, were also guilty of reproducing this pathology, right? So in this sort of historical sense, there's a way that they're broadening out from neoliberalism, at least on their own terms. But and so that shift happens, and we could talk about why it happened. And my book, in part, is about explaining, historically situating like why movements shifted away from a prior discourse instead of movement tactics towards a new discourse instead of movement tactics. But without going into that detail now, I do want to know a couple of continuities, because the question asked about them, and I think it's important. There's often a seduction, and I'm guilty of this, to like see sharply delineated periods, right, and to see like really sharp ruptures between different moments of political activity. And I think there was a cataclysmic change here, but there were a lot of continuities that shot across it, and I'll just name two of them for now. One is that during the period in which neoliberalism and anti-neoliberalism was like the primary framing of movement activity in Ecuador, and that the indigenous movement was very much a part of that and a protagonist of that discourse, locally within, or I should say regionally within the Amazon, there was an incipient critique, very militant critique of oil extraction. So at the same time period that the National Indigenous Federation and different regional indigenous federations in the highlands especially were really focused on neoliberalism and, as Bret was saying earlier, on this vision of like sovereignty, national sovereignty over resources, and fought for that. At that same time, within the Amazon, and particularly in the southeastern Amazon, and particularly therefore in parts of the Amazon that weren't, there wasn't previous oil extraction in, and there were like new attempts of oil extraction starting in the mid-90s. In that context, Amazonian indigenous communities, the Shuar, Achuar, and Amazonian Quechua especially, but not exclusively, were developing what I call like a proto-anti-extractivism. And it's like a clunky and inelegant term, but what I mean is that they started to pinpoint oil extraction as the source of the problems in their lives, in their territories, and in their natural environments, and use that language more than they use the language of neoliberalism. And not only that, in terms of their tactics, they developed like a militant repertoire of like direct action, of resisting oil activity at the point of extraction, and of calling for, on a policy level, things like moratoria on oil extraction. And that was very different than the national and some of the other regional indigenous movements that were still calling for like something like democratic national ownership of extraction, but definitely not like an end to extraction, right? So the continuity is that there are movements that before the time period that I'm noting the change were already making these calls. And what I say in the book is that their critique of extraction, of oil extraction in the Amazon, and the way it affected their territories and livelihoods and cultural integrity was like scaled up in this later period to be a more total critique of extraction embraced by many more groups, right? So that's one continuity that cuts across. And, like we were saying before, people make history under certain circumstances and not of their own making. And the anti-extractive movements that emerged in the later period were using discursive sources and tactics that had been developed in a previous moment, right? So that's one continuity. And the last one I'll be quicker with, which is just that I really come to believe that the legacy of dependency theory, and even more broadly of like world systems theory and third world Marxism, was really more present than I thought at first in both the state-led project and in the anti-extractive project. Like they really do draw on a well of some similar critical intellectual theories that come very much out of Latin America, but also out of the global South, or as, maybe in the past called the Third World more broadly. And I think it's interesting to see how like Korea and the movements in their conflicts with one another are like redeploying elements of these critical ideas about capitalism, about the place of the Third World in the or global South in the global economy, but drawing different conclusions from some of those shared theoretical resources.
Yeah, well, this is an interesting question comparing the two countries, because you could say that there is not a large anti-extractive movement in Bolivia. I think the important difference is that oil in the Amazon and Ecuador is really much easier to mobilize around and against. Gas has its own sort of toxic effects, but they're certainly not as visible as those of oil and oil spills and so forth. And by and large, folks who live in the gas-producing region have acquiesced to the projects, if not wholeheartedly supported them. There are sort of sites of anti-extractiveness emerging around expansion of the potential expansion of fracking. The concept of extractivism is now being applied to large-scale agro-industry in the east of Bolivia, which is referred to as extractive agriculture, referring primarily to soy and the attempt to expand GMOs. And I think that there's some traction there. But the whole issue of the past year in Bolivia, the coup, the ouster of Evo, whether you want to call it a coup or not, had a lot to do with a lot of talk about lithium. And Thea is working on this question of lithium right now. And it's a rabbit hole, so we don't have to jump down in it. But the point being is that there's virtually no opposition to extracting lithium. The question is, who's going to benefit and what are we going to do with it? So, as I say, I think I don't know if there's been a sort of sea change as like the one that Thea is talking about in Ecuador. I think there's some potential for that as the revenues from gas dwindle out, and it becomes clear that the economy needs something else besides dependence on one or two export commodities. We might see some emerging efforts, but right now the anti-extractivist discourse, in my read, is primarily situated in NGOs and research institutes in Bolivia. And this is one of the, I think, one of the political horizons that will shape the next 5 or 10 years in Bolivia.
I also want to just tag on to the end of that. That's super interesting, and I sense that there was, partly from reading your work, but I sense that there was a difference in the sort of uptake and circulation of this discourse or critique in these two different places. But I just want to underscore that I think an important point that Bret was making is that a lot of the movement analysis and tactics and ideas are really deeply related to like the material conditions of specific sectors, right? And so like we don't per se get the same exact type of resistance in one extractive sector or another, or we might, but it's because maybe that type of resistance started in one sector and like migrated to another, right? But I think it's important to keep in mind, and both of us, though we're focused on a lot on ideas, we also, I think, very much ground those ideas in like those material circumstances. And Bret's absolutely right about oil, but I would sort of add a little specificity to that, which is that I think oil is even more contentious when it's like a new sector, right? Meaning when like there is no oil extraction in a given territory. And then that idea, the specter of like the oil spill and of water contamination, all those things is like very stark. And something similar about mining, which is part of what made it so contentious in Ecuador, was that it was new. And also to even go beyond oil, not to downplay. I mean, oil, I think, is the worst culprit of environmental, destruction in the world, whether it's climate or localized pollution. I mean, I'm not downplaying oil, but the unique thing about mining is like its land footprint and how just incredibly incredibly expansive an open pit mine is, and how many villages might be displaced by one mine, or many hunting grounds or spiritually relevant, territorial sites might be despoiled or just all out, replaced by mining infrastructure. So again, just like how sectors appear to people, how they experience them, how present their environmental effects are, how palpable they are, all of this relates to the forms of resistance that are engendered.
Great, thank you. So we are quite familiar with the notion of a left developmentist state, one that mobilizes the country's resources and nationalizes said resources if they are in the hands of imperialists or corporations, to fight poverty and bolster socially inclusive growth. For many on the left around the world, this kind of developmentalist state remains the ideal. In different ways, both your books challenge this consensus, showing both the old left developmentist model is no longer feasible in the face of climate change, and just as importantly, that it never really worked for Indigenous communities to begin with. And can both of you just elaborate on this a little bit, talk about how your books discuss this?
Should I start on that one? I could start on that one. So I would say yes and no. I guess the left developmentalist state is basically the idea that the state should own strategic sectors of the economy, own and control strategic sectors of natural resources, but also utilities, transportation infrastructures, and so forth, and direct the ownership of those resources and goods towards ameliorating poverty. So that's the basic model, I guess, as we understand it. I don't know that model is no longer feasible. I mean, that actually is not a bad idea in theory. Of course, as the question points out, this is becomes problematic when it depends on fossil fuels. So certainly in relationship to climate change, as long as that model relies on fossil fuels, then yes, it is going to reproduce more contradictions than it's worth, not just ecologically speaking, but both of the books talk about the other kinds of contradictions that fossil fuel economies specifically produce because of their material nature. But this is the challenge for Bolivia. Someone was saying, why don't they just they've got sun and wind, it's the Andes, there's so much sun and there's so much wind, and they've got the lithium, and they could just have renewable energy and everyone could produce solar power and electricity. And well, yes and no, because of the dependence on a global dollar-centric economy, or even if the Chinese make inroads into the domination of the dollar, these economies are still structured on dependence on foreign currency. To get foreign currency, you've got to sell something to the outside. And one of the huge challenges that we have, we can critique extractivism, we can critique gas and oil. Some of the things I hear in response, well, there should be more tourism. Well, tourism isn't exactly a wonderful thing to turn a country into a tourist object. But at any rate, this is the challenge. I don't think it's so much a problem of the idea that the state should play a major role in the economy. I don't have a problem with that. It depends on what the shape of the economy is and what the impacts of that are ecologically, socially, and politically.
Yeah, I agree, and you took some of the words out of my mouth. I mean, I would have said some of the same things. Like, I think that the idea of a state that is invested in social welfare and is trying to achieve some kind of sovereignty, meaning not being dominated constantly by other states, and is investing in like the future of the country in some way is a noble one that I subscribe to. I think that things get complex in two directions, and I'm just going to underscore some things that Bret said and then maybe add a little bit. one direction has to do with like the classic dilemmas of developmentalism, meaning the classic dilemmas of attempting from a position of dependency and periphery in the global economy to like climb up the ladder of development, like remove the yoke of being in this subordinate position and sort of kind of develop out of a place in which you are previously just dependent on raw material extraction and export. So, and that itself, of course, is a legacy that dates to colonialism. So there are these classic dilemmas from the 1930s to today, and in some ways they haven't changed dramatically. Though, I don't want to downplay that nothing has changed in the past 100 years. But the problems of this project, while noble and I think salutary in some ways, are also pervasive. So there's that. The whole point, I shouldn't say point, but the whole, thing about being in this dependent position in the global economy, exactly as Bret said, is that you may lack domestic capital for investment. You are on this losing end of unequal exchange. So yes, you have, sectors in your economy, but there are sectors that aren't as profitable as the things that you need to import, right? So you're constantly sort of losing from being a raw material exporter. In the case of something like lithium, but in Bolivia, but even something like a more traditional extractive sector like large-scale mining in Ecuador, if it's a new sector, you may lack sort of state and institutional capacity and expertise to really regulate it in a way that is more sustainable. From a more sort of economic perspective, I don't think that a non-renewable resource can really be like environmentally sustainable. But that aside, so you have all these dilemmas and contradictions, and I think that state actors have tried various ways to sort of cut through these Gordian knots. But at the end of the day, the problem is at a higher scale, right? The problem is at the scale of the world system. And I don't want to make it sound impossible to resolve, but I think there's the old adage, like you can't have socialism in one country. It's sort of like, can you get out of dependency in one country? Or can you get out of dependency without implicating the world order in a more direct sense? And I'll come back to that in a second. But the second set of problems, so those are all just like within the sort of state's eye view, what are the difficulties of left developmentalism? Then, of course, there's a whole host of environmental problems, climate related, though these countries are far down the list in terms of, being guilty for contributing to emissions, but there's certainly localized climate devastation. And then there's the deforestation, which I think is probably the most concerning thing at a local and global level. We know that tropical deforestation is like the number 2 contributor behind fossil fuels to global warming, right? So, tropical deforestation is often an effect of mining or oil or these other extractive sectors. So there's environmental critiques and indigenous rights critiques that are actually quite linked to the environmental critiques. I want to just close by saying that one of the more inspiring things for me recently is that in parallel with and sort of in conversation with the Green New Deal idea in the US, there have been a bunch of similar conversations in Latin America, which takes this question, like kind of gets at the heart of this question. Is it, and the heart of actually where Bret ended, like, would it be possible to do something like left developmentalism, to use the state for social well-being without rapaciously extracting and without being caught in like the traps of dependency? Basically, that's like the question for our moment from the perspective of the global South beyond Latin America. And in Latin America, there have been recently a bunch of interesting ideas around this. They haven't been put into policy practice yet, but they are attracting a lot of movement and policymaker support. So there's the Pacto Ecosocial, or the Eco-Social Pact, which came out of Argentina, but has like gotten lots of support from around the region on the left. There's the Nuestra América Verde, which is Our Green America, this sort of parallel set of ideas coming from a more policy angle. And then CEPAL, or ECLAC, the UN's body that deals with Latin American development and the Caribbean, has its like idea for a big push, which is a little more technocratic, but in a similar vein, like how can we use the state for social and ecological well-being, right? So there's a lot of interesting ideas there. One thing I just want to note about them, and I suggest that readers just check them out, they're all available on the internet and translated in English, is to say that one of the points that the Pacto Ecosocial makes, which is probably the most politically militant of the three that I just mentioned, is that we actually can't do this. We can't have a state that's oriented towards social and environmental well-being primarily, unless we get out of the yoke of debt, right? And so I've really begun to realize that like something like socio-ecological flourishing in the global south is very connected to a reduction, if not an outright cancellation of global debt, which is one of the mechanisms that keeps countries trapped in that type of financial and economic dependency that Bret was talking about. So, again, thinking across scales a little bit, the problem gets like bigger, but I think we get maybe closer to what some of the real solutions might be.
Great, thank you. I'd love to talk a little bit about terminology. So most people are familiar with the idea of a resource curse. And while neither of you disagree with this idea per se, you do find it in your books a little reductive, instead taking a more comprehensive approach to what the gaseous or extractivist state model is. And then, related, both of you draw on popular terms that activists use to describe the extractive state model. Can you tell us something about these terms, what they mean, and explain why you chose to incorporate them into your theorization?
I'll comment on the gasiferous state, which is probably an unfelicitous term, but I think I stole it or borrowed it from Oskar Raúl Prada, who used to be a mass militant, but has become one of their most outspoken critics. But I use it more metaphorically than anything else to refer to these different aspects and contradictions that sort of grew out of the dependence on gas revenues. But in terms of the resource curse, right, the critique of the resource curse from my world, and probably Thea's too, is largely because it generally ignores the role of multinational firms and international lenders in creating the conditions for financial collapse or financial stagnation that go along with the oil industry. It's often simply used as a way to say, here, look at this corrupt country that didn't manage its oil resources correctly. So that's the problem of the concept as it's usually used. And nothing against political scientists, but mostly in political science. And Thea can correct me if I'm wrong there. But at least in the crude terms of the idea is that having too much of a resource can stagnate growth. It didn't happen to Bolivia. In fact, they did better than most countries in Latin America over the past 14 years, and partly because gas is less volatile than oil. They had long-term contracts. The prices were up, but they still had what's called a take-or-pay agreement. So Brazil had to pay for it, whether they used it or not, and that allowed for them to save money and to plan and use that money relatively wisely. Now, were there problems and corruption? Sure, but overall, it's very different from a place like Venezuela, where oil is the only game in town. It's absolutely volatile. And when the price falls out, everything else falls out. So Bolivia luckily escaped that.
Yeah, I agree. First and foremost, that the resource curse term is very predominant in political science, and it's sort of linked term of Dutch disease that's very predominant in economics. But I agree with the characterization, which is one of the reasons I felt the need to take it on, because everything I was taught in graduate school, or I read in sort of political science journals about resource sectors, uses this lens. Even when they critique it or modify it, it's like all of the debates take place on the terrain of the resource curse. And I find that terrain extremely constraining and not rigorous, actually, in terms of what it's trying to explain. And the fact that Bolivia doesn't fit the model, I think shows that, there are actually lots of countries that don't fit the model. It's not clear to me that any country really fits the most simplified version of the model. I think that, to sort of respond to some things that Bret said, I agree that it ignores completely the role of not only firms, but just of like fossil capitalism. Like how are extractive resources deeply linked to the development, the uneven and unequal development of capitalism over time? There's nothing to say about that in the resource curse theory, which sort of departs from like a methodological nationalism. Like everything takes place within one state, always that one state screwing up its resource abundance and ending up with autocracy or underdevelopment. But how that state is situated in transnational flows of finances, resources, and other traded goods is like not usually attended to. I love this line from Timothy Mitchell in Carbon Democracy, which says all states are oil states, right? Like the idea that Saudi Arabia is an oil state, but the US isn't. I mean, aside from the fact the US is actually an oil state, even in normal resource cost terms now. But anyway, every state's an oil state because every place uses oil and every place is sort of embedded in those power relations of fossil capitalism. And there's another term that I like, which I think gets at the nub of like why it doesn't help explain what happened in Bolivia and, or really anywhere else, in my opinion, which is Michael Watts, who's a scholar of oil in Nigeria. His term is commodity determinism. So what he critiques it for, which I share as well, is this idea that like oil like walks onto the political stage and like does things, that like oil is like creates outcomes. And so that's what he means by commodity determinism. And it's not true. Oil or any resource is embedded in these political relationships, has very context dependent effects. Like in some cases we get resistance to oil from social movements, in other cases we don't. In some cases oil has been used to generate something like economic development. In other cases, its use has resulted in underdevelopment, right? I mean, it's just like the outcomes are too variable to attribute them to a single cause, right? And the last thing I'll say here, and then I could, if we want, talk a little about extractivismo, but I know I'm already going on a little bit. The last thing I'll say, and maybe this does link to both of our cases a little bit more, which is that, for me, and I think in Bret's book too, like instead of resources determining something like a authoritarianism or like a lack of democracy, that's one of the key predictions of the resource curse, that resource dependency leads to either bad quality democracies or outright authoritarianism. And I think what both of our cases show is that actually resources are fields of contention, right? And there are opportunities and contexts in which different groups proclaim different visions of, in both of these cases, of democracy, meaning like no one didn't want democracy, but there were different views of what counted as democracy, of who the democratic subject was, of what practices enact democracy. And so instead of like this kind of curse or pathology, what we get is actually a really, I think, vibrant political field that sort of surrounds these resources. And I'll say briefly on extractivismo, and the term that Bret uses is super interesting. I need to think about it more. I mean, I love these different terms that activists and critical intellectuals come up with to think about the politics of extraction. Extractivismo, as I said earlier, so I actually don't need to say much more now, it shares with the resource curse in an interesting way. That it attributes a lot of problems to resource extraction. But I think what's very different about it is it sees those problems in a much broader context, like it thinks about global capitalism and imperialism in a much longer time frame. The time frame of extractivismo discourse is from colonialism to the present. It's not about something that just happened. It's about like this longue durée affliction. And it's less concerned with like that it's going to produce like economic underdevelopment or some regime type, and more interested in like the territorialized and environmental and cultural effects even of extraction. And so I think it really just, in all senses, time, space, substantive, it just really broadens the realm of like what are the effects of resource extraction.
Great, thank you. Both of your books are quite interdisciplinary. And I'd love to hear a little bit about what the fields are that your book intersects with, how you arrived at this approach, and especially about the growing field of natural resource or extraction studies.
Well, I can start basically where Thea just left off. That concept of extractivism demands a multidisciplinary approach. For all the reasons that she just detailed, because we're not talking about isolated economic. There's no such thing as isolated economic processes anyway. But since we have economics departments, we've got to draw a boundary somewhere. But at any rate, you can't talk about extractivism without talking about patriarchy. And if that's not clear to you, then that's why we should be doing more work that crosses these boundaries. But you also can't talk about it unless you have an understanding of some of these issues that we're commenting on today: political, economic relationships, world systems, relationships, dynamics of dependency and exports. So I've always sort of had a envy of geographers and some parts of political science, like the kind of part that Thea's in. I think there's a part of political science that I don't envy at all, but is that their ability to sort of tell larger stories. But I also respect my own discipline, anthropology, for its ability to tell human stories. And if you can, tell human stories alongside of the big story, and have a much richer portrait of the complexity of things, but also, in many ways, helping you to give more clarity. Because oftentimes the debates about oil and gas are basically say, well, did their GDP go up or their GDP go down? And nobody looks over here and says, well, for some reason, violence against women is increasing intensively in recent years, and maybe that has something to do with the expansion of the extractive economy in that part of the country, or human trafficking, as the case in Bolivia is a seemingly direct correlation between human trafficking and the gas industry in southeastern Bolivia. So I think an interdisciplinary approach to some extent is crucial, and I'm always asking my students, tell me something about the bigger political picture. And if that's all I get, then I say, well, tell me something about the human experience. And I think that's what we're both striving to do, although I won't speak for Thea.
That is what I'm striving to do. And that I think captured just the multidimensionality of extractivism and resource extraction is kind of pushes you, I think, to explore it from these different angles. And I think that's especially the case, to circle back to the beginning of our conversation. If you're doing this from an ethnographic perspective, you can't ignore like how multifaceted it is. Like every interview or every, protest you observe, or, community meeting you observe, like 100 different topics come up. And what is actually the challenge is sometimes putting aside the things you're not going to focus on as much, because really everything is relevant. We could say to everything else, but I think particularly in context of extractive economies, so much of social life is like routed through extractive relationships. And so it becomes impossible to ignore culture, economics, politics, and their respective sort of domains of academic inquiry. In my experience, in addition to that sort of fieldwork experience, like making those connections clear for me, I was sort of pushed in a way out of political science, not totally by my own choosing. I mean, I remained a political scientist, but meaning I had to search beyond political science to understand what I was doing. Because at that time, which wasn't so long ago, but I was starting my dissertation in like 2010, there was very little on mining in political science, like none. And my dissertation focused on mining. My book expanded to include oil as well. But and there was really nothing. And it was like the only resource that political scientists care about was oil. And the way in which they cared about it, as we just discussed, was like very simplistic. So there was not much on mining, let alone, agriculture, if I wanted to look at soy or gas, I mean, there wouldn't have been really much in political science on these topics. So I went precisely as Bret laid out to anthropology and history, and also geography became like a big discipline that I was, it's a shame that because of the weirdness of our academic system in the US, it's a discipline that is pretty limited to public institutions, but it has produced some of the, not there's anything wrong with public institutions. It's just a shame that not every academic, university has a geography department, because it produces, I think, some of the best work on these topics. One just quick thing I'd say, just to stop repeating what Bret said, because I think we really see this very similarly. Just one thing that I want to add that about my own sort of political science background and how I used it. While it turned out that a lot of political science sort of theories of like kind of empirical approaches to resource extraction weren't super useful to me, except as like objects of critique. What ended up being interesting to connect with my fieldwork was my background in political theory. And so like thinking about how conceptions of what democracy is, who the demos are, what the state is, what it means to critique and to envision another world, thinking deeply of more contemporary political theories around like what nature is and things like that. So I found some interesting resonances, between that sort of subfield of political science, we might say, and my field work, and unexpected resonances. Like it was almost like the activists I was working with were in their own right political theorists. Like they were using extremely sophisticated language to think about the relationship between humans and nature in ways that I think political philosophy and theory are just really catching up with at this point. So that was a place where I could sort of draw on my disciplinary background, but otherwise I went outside of my discipline quite a bit.
Great. So let's, I'm going to skip question 8 here for the moment, because I think this next question is a really important one. The New York Times recently ran a special supplement on deforestation in the Amazon, subtitled "The Amazon Has Seen Our Future." The implication being that political and environmental havoc that Brazil is witnessing today will soon envelop the whole world. In that vein, can you tell us a bit about the lessons that battles against resource extraction in Bolivia and Ecuador hold for political struggles in other parts of the world?
I guess it's my turn. That's a tough one. I think the lesson that Bolivia offers is that we can't really take for granted that progressive governments are necessarily environmentally minded governments, whether for things outside of their control or not. What Evo Morales and the MAS did was remarkable in many ways. A radical transformation of the country, addressing poverty, redistributing resources, dramatically changing the meaning of what it means to be Bolivian and to have rights in the country. So to take nothing away from that. On the other hand, we also saw that when it came to maintaining power, constructing hegemony, which hopefully if you ever take control, that's basically your goal, is to construct hegemony. That required a lot of compromises, especially with agro-industry and especially with the extractive industry that have contributed to what we're seeing in the Bolivian Amazon in the case of the fires. The fires are not Evo's fault. There are fires every year. Farmers clear their fields every year. But in the past few years, certain policies and certain decrees that Evo signed off on were an attempt to cultivate political support from that sector, and they've had absolutely negative effects on the Amazon. So I think the lesson there is to be sympathetically critical, even when you have people like Evo Morales who are basically heroes for most of the country of Bolivia.
Yeah, I think that I agree with all of that. I'll sort of answer more from the angle of resistance, because I think, to sort of complement, how to think about the state and how to think about left projects and once they reach state power. I think that I draw like a couple of lessons from anti-extractive resistance in Ecuador for places beyond Ecuador, whether in Latin America, but also in the US and the global North. I think the lessons are global in a sense, which is that there is, under current historical conditions, there is like a real power, and I mean like leverage, capacity, but also like moral power, witness, and just strategic power to communities that are directly affected by the worst effects of resource extraction taking action to obstruct or stall, slow down, or outright oppose extractive projects at those like key choke points. And the choke points can be the mine or the oil field, or the gas field itself. It can be like, in the sort of logistics of how those goods are transported. It can be pipelines, right? So there's a whole complex, increasingly complex and globally dispersed infrastructure of extraction, and communities, urban and rural and in between, that are like sit at key points of how those extracted goods like move around the world, have a special sort of power in a way. I don't want to essentialize it, but I mean it in a, first of all, totally instrumental and strategic sense, which is that they are, if they can block a pipeline from working or from being built at all, similar to any other element of infrastructure, they can really slow down that project, or in some cases like an entire sector, depending on how strategically located that infrastructure is. So they have real power. And I think, the way in which those communities bear witness to like the worst aspects of capitalism is also just very compelling on a political or moral or ethical level, right? So they have that sort of power of persuasion. And I took that away from my book, and I take it away from, how Standing Rock, Standing Rock in the U.S. or the fights against the Keystone Pipeline. And as I said, it's not specific to Ecuador. I think that the flip side of that is also true, which is that there's a challenge sometimes. And I think we face this challenge right now in, debates over the Green New Deal and a just transition in the U.S., which is like, how do we broaden in two ways, like broaden to communities that may not be or may not feel like they are, or may not palpably sense that they are like directly affected by extraction, yet we all are, right? But they may not feel that way or experience life that way. So how do we broaden in that sense? And then also, how do we broaden from like a resistance posture to a posture of like, this is the world we want to build? And those are, I think, that the sort of power of directly affected communities, and then also the need to scale out and beyond, whether it's through alliances or through other types of movements or other tactics and visions. I think like that duality is expressed well in the Ecuador case. But again, I think it's something that movements around the world grapple with. And, on the one hand, like direct action against fossil capitalism is absolutely essential, I believe, to like keep it all on the ground, or as much of it in the ground as possible. On the other hand, direct action against fossil capitalism is sort of not enough, which seems, amazing to say, because that's itself a huge task. But there are other types of communities, movements, and visions that would need to sort of be brought into the fold, that may not be living next to a pipeline or a planned pipeline, or again, may not experience their lives through the lens of extraction's effects on them.
So we have not a whole lot of time left, but just wanted to give you a moment to open this up perhaps a little bit. If you would like to take a moment to talk about, current politics, especially Bret, if you would like to mention anything about the recent elections in Bolivia and how what you both have seen in your books and talk about in your books, if that contributes at all.
Sure. I mean, we all need some good news. So I could say, and I know Thea's been following it closely too. So yeah, well, the Evo was ousted in last November. A very difficult 11 months passed, compounded by the COVID pandemic of an abusive, incompetent, and corrupt government. New elections were just held last week, and Evo's party, the MAS, won by an astounding, I think the final count was 55.1% of the vote, crushing second and third place challengers in a situation where a lot of people, myself included, on bad days, thought that it would go to a second round and the MAS might lose, primarily because the polling in Bolivia is very skewed toward the urban sectors. So that's a pretty amazing recent past. And all of these questions we've been talking about today are questions that this new government faces. Will they continue with the sort of opening to agro-industrial extractivism? will they continue with the expansion of GMOs? Will they attempt to deepen the dependence on the gas industry, or will they be able to redirect the state efforts in new economic directions? And then the lithium, of course, is another question. So all of these issues that we've been discussing complicate the next few years for the Mas government. But the good thing is that the victory was so overwhelming that I think it's a much better outcome than even a second round victory would have been had the centrist or the far right candidate had very little chance of becoming president. But had the centrist candidate won, there would have been a coalition cobbled together of the more reactionary right wing and the right-leaning centrists. And that would have probably led to more political conflict and instability. So at the end of the day, I think Bolivia has a little bit of breathing room, but the macroeconomic situation is going to be challenging. And as I wrote in another piece just recently, I think winning the elections was probably the easy part. The hard part lies ahead. So.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that assessment. And I think, it'll be really interesting, and I'll be closely observing and reading the work of scholars like Bret to see how this unfolds and the actual practice of governing in this context from the left, right? Totally different situation than coming to power during a commodity boom, coming to power not only during a period of low global growth, recession, et cetera, but also of just like extreme devastation, economic and health-wise. So it's a real challenge that on the one hand, I think calls for a left approach to governance, right? To actually care for people and their needs and health and communities, but also complicates it in a context of, as we were saying, dependency and low tax rates and this reliance on trade revenues that are just not happening so much right now. And so I'm curious how they'll go. Luis Arce has indicated an interest on the one hand in like maintaining something like an extractive model of development, but sort of moving to different extractive sectors, right? And he's really highlighted biodiesel and lithium, which are sort of interesting because they're both related to the so-called kind of like green economy or energy transition, but they're sort of environmentally fraught in different ways, especially actually biodiesel. But lithium has its own environmental consequences that have been borne out in Chile and Argentina, where it's much further along in terms of the sector. So I'm very curious to see how that goes. And I guess I'll just close by saying that I think, with the resounding victory for Mas, and it's so important that it was resounding. I mean, that can't be emphasized enough, not just for the left, but for, democracy, for like confidence in the results, all of the things that Bret just emphasized. So we have that resounding victory. We have like an even maybe more resounding victory just in terms of the numbers for rewriting Chile's constitution, right? So like, I think almost 80% of voters that participated, and it was a pretty massive turnout, voted both to rewrite the Constitution and to do so through a democratically elected constituent assembly, which now puts Chile on a similar path to Bolivia, Venezuela, and Ecuador, a decade ago, or more than a decade ago, that rewrote their constitutions through some kind of popular participatory process, through indirectly popular participatory, but still with a lot of participation, and resulted in extremely progressive constitutions. Obviously, the conditions in Chile are a bit different, but I think that there's no doubt that the constitution that results from this will be better from a progressive, from a human rights, from a state sovereignty, et cetera, perspective than the current constitution, which was just literally a way to extend the dictatorship into the present. And so I think having both of these in view, what's happening with what happened in Bolivia, and now what happened in Chile. And then also the sort of social movement uprisings that really were proliferating prior to the pandemic in Ecuador, in Chile, and elsewhere. I think, what I would say as a closing thing is that I think it's correct that the pink tide was in retreat or is in retreat or is no longer the sort of hegemonic political formation of the region. But I think it's equally true that the right has not attained something like regional political hegemony. I was much more scared about that, in Bolsonaro and Macri. I mean, all these people were elected around the same time and they were neoliberal or neo-fascist and they were personally, politically, for me, quite frightening, and they remain so in the places that they're still in power. But I think that, it's harder to make that claim now. And I think it's more like an open question of what political trajectory the region will take. And we know from the past that those tend to be patterned, meaning many countries tend to move in the same direction because they share a lot of circumstances. And there's a lot of activist networks that cut across borders. So I'm curious if we're seeing the beginnings of, I won't call it the pink tide because history doesn't like exactly repeat itself, but like if we're seeing the beginnings of like a new leftward trajectory or just a sort of ongoing moment of political, the political winds shifting. But it's certainly the idea that there's a right-wing hegemony in Latin America, I think, is certainly in question.
Well, thank you so much for being here and for your thoughts. And this was a great conversation. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks a lot. This was great.